Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 27 of the Stained Glass Podcast. I am your host, Jessica Spurlock. On today's episode, I'll tell you a story about how I became an engineer and how God used that to reveal empowerment. Let's get started. As I have stated in previous episodes, I'm not a professional podcaster. My real job is that I am an engineer. And by the sound of my voice, you can probably guess that I am a woman. And you would be correct. I am an engineer and I am a woman. And depending on what generation you belong to, that may or may not sound like two things that go together. My dad, who's also an engineer, has often said that in order to do this, I should be prepared to work twice as hard to be considered only half as equal. But I decided to do it anyway. Of course it was unfair, but I hope to change people's minds with my skills. I thought acceptance would be easier with God backing me too. Here's what happened. Growing up, my dad brought home a Macintosh computer in the mid to late 80s, which was kind of uncommon in those days. Some of my earliest memories are of this computer, and one of them had to do with this game called Math Blaster. This game would let you answer math problems, and then it would shoot the rocket at the end of the level, and then would get progressively harder as it went on. And when I was 3 years old, I had gotten it to the point to where I wasn't able to make the rocket shoot anymore because I was missing the math problems because they'd gotten too hard for my little 3-year-old brain to do. I begged my parents to reset it so it would be easy enough again to blast off the rockets, but they encouraged problem solving and simply said, "It's not possible." Now, I may have only been 3, but I was not buying this at all. So that night, after my parents tucked me in, I snuck in a hefty 200-page programming manual into bed. And I researched the solution by flashlight under my blanket when I was supposed to be sleeping. And the next morning, I proudly threw down this giant programming manual on the table in front of my parents and pointed to the page and said, "Config.sys, Daddy, that's how you make the game easy again so I could blast the rockets into space." I've always been fascinated by technology, electronics, and computer programming. When I was about 10, I got this really cool circuits kit where they had lots of projects you could do just by connecting the different wires to different components attached to springs on a board. Actually, one of my favorite projects I did with that kit was an actual broadcasted AM radio station. I used to pretend to have interviews on my little radio show and be a DJ, which, now that I think about it, kind of explains my evolution into podcasting, huh? But also growing up, we did 4-H for a few years in middle school, but we didn't have livestock, so I would do computer programming projects or photography. Then, once the internet started gaining traction, I started developing websites for people in the late 90s and early 2000s while I was in high school and college. The summer before my senior year in high school, we had a job shadow someone in a field that we were interested in pursuing. I wanted to be an engineer, at least I thought I did, but I didn't know the type. My dad worked at a chemical plant as an engineer, and so he brought me there to see the different kinds of engineering in action. Mechanical, chemical, civil, electrical, all intriguing, but no sparks. Then he took me to a room upstairs. It was called a control room. And this room had a few computer monitors on a desk where the graphics displayed on the screens were cartoon representations of the plant processes. So I pointed to the screens and said, "That's what I want to do." So he arranged another job shadowing opportunity with the contracting firm who handled those control system designs, which is what they're called. And so I decided to pursue degrees in electrical engineering and computer science and be a control systems engineer based on my talks with the engineers at the contracting firm. And the next year, I started at a very small but highly regarded engineering school in southern West Virginia. And I was the only girl in my graduating class of electrical engineers. It was difficult at first, navigating some of the older professors' biases, and also I had issues with classmates questioning my abilities. One time, in the lab for my digital electronics design class, I had to connect this very tiny circuit, and it was super tedious. The classmates who were in my group kept telling me how to hook it up, which I already knew how to do, and they were also talking about how I was going to screw it up. But Finally, I got frustrated and I pulled out every single last wire and threw it in front of them and said, "You do it." I asserted myself, earning the respect not only from my lab partners, but also from a previously dismissive professor. The college journey echoed what my dad had always told me, that I would need to work twice as hard to be seen as half as equal. I had to work extra hard to get better grades than my male classmates to win over my professors, but eventually that hard work paid off as I was the top of my electrical engineering graduating class standings, and I won the Freshman of the Year award for the entire university and eventually won the College of Engineering's highest award. But to back up a little bit, the spring of my freshman year, I attended the college's career fair where the contracting firm I'd visited in high school actually had a booth. I went up and I met them, and they mistook me for a graduating senior due to my demeanor, but eventually they remembered me. So I landed their very first ever internship program. And I worked there during my breaks between semesters. Most of the engineers were friendly, a couple of them patronized me, and one was a little too friendly and needed some clear boundaries established. Thankfully, he left after my second summer. And if you listen to episode 2 of the Stained Glass podcast, where I tell the story of our connection to the mass shooting at Virginia Tech, you would have heard that I went to work full-time for this same company, which was acquired by a larger engineering firm near the capital city. This company went out of business at the start of the recession in 2008, and within a 3-year stretch, I worked for 9 different companies, including my own, just because they couldn't keep up in the economy. They had to keep shutting their doors. And nearly every time I would start anywhere new, from then on, it would be the same story. I was treated like a little girl who had no business stepping foot onto an industrial site, who had a fear of getting dirty, who couldn't hear or tell a crude joke, who couldn't understand the complexity of equipment or just science in general, who only got the job because of who my dad is, or by providing extra benefits to the decision makers, which obviously never happened. And that didn't help matters that I was usually the only woman. And I overcame these gender biases and stereotypes every single time. I overcame the lack of representation. I overcame the toxic workplace cultures. And yes, I had to work twice as hard. And sometimes I had to be brave enough to leave and to trust God to get me through it. And that's the key phrase right there. Trust God. God has provided for me every step of the way of this journey. And I've asked Him every time to go before me. And I had made several leaps of faith in my career, not knowing how it was going to end up. God's blessings has led me to a workplace where, when I share my past struggles, it surprises my supportive coworkers. Now, I share achievements without the anxiety of repercussions, which is so freeing. My employers and colleagues celebrate my successes, creating a supportive and affirming environment. The Bible is full of applications for navigating challenges in male-dominated career fields. And I'm just going to reference the verses, and I'll put them in the show notes if you want to go back and read them later. First, Genesis 1:27 tells us that everyone, regardless of gender, bears God's image and are equally valuable. You are worthy of pursuing a career in whatever field God is calling you to. But remember that your identity and worth come from God, not from the world, as stated in Psalm 139, verse 14. And God has gifted everyone in unique ways, and this empowers us to use those gifts for His glory. As it states in Jeremiah 29:11, because God has a purpose for your life, you can pursue the career with a sense of purpose, knowing that you're fulfilling a calling. And if you work in a male-dominated career field, you can draw inspiration from stories to be bold while facing your challenges head-on. In Esther's story, she showed courage when she approached the king to save her people in chapter 4, verse 16. The Bible also highlights the importance of community. Proverbs 27:17 emphasizes the value of iron sharpening iron. Women can find encouragement and strength in professional networks through mentorship. And biblical teachings often emphasize justice and standing up for what is right. Women in male-dominated career fields can advocate for themselves and others, promoting equality in their workplaces, just like in Micah 6:8. I hope that by hiding God's word in your heart, that you can draw strength, wisdom, and courage, and a sense of purpose to thrive in whatever career field God has called you to. Dear Lord, I am grateful for the path you've led me on in my career, a journey filled with lessons, challenges, and triumphs. I pray for those who listen that they might find clarity in their calling and embrace it with confidence. Help them remember that their identity and strength are found in you alone. Grant them the courage to face hurdles, wisdom from your word to persevere, and resilience to thrive despite the obstacles. Bless them with a supportive community that fosters confidence and advocacy where they can stand united. May your purpose guide them to flourish in their respective careers. In your name I pray, amen. I need each of you listening to write a positive review or rating of the Stained Glass Podcast on your podcast platform, because positive reviews will legitimize this podcast and will help you push this ministry out to others and spread the encouragement around even further. If you do not know how to post a review, check out some of my reels on Instagram and Facebook. I would love for you to come hang out with me on social media. I am at the Stained Glass Podcast on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube, and in the Stained Glass Podcast group on Facebook. And you can also email me at thestainedglasspodcast@gmail.com. The next episode launches in 2 weeks. Until then, this has been Jessica Spurlock with the Stained Glass Podcast. Go be a blessing.